I once naively believed earning my family's love just required more effort. I was wrong. The exact price was $150,000, and it was not even meant for me. The night my parents tossed that check to my sister, they thought they were burying me. They never realized I was a seed. 2 years later, when their glamorous world burned to ash, they crawled to the forest where I took root, begging for shade. Hello, wonderful listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff to cover their living expenses and continue creating stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or clicking the PayPal link in the description or comments below. Today, we follow the story of Amaya Pena. The chandelier light fractured through crystal wine glasses at the most exclusive steakhouse in Austin, Texas. The air in the private dining room was heavy with the rich scent of dry-aged Wagyu beef, melted truffle butter, and the cloying sweetness of my mother's signature designer perfume. It was a Tuesday evening, but for the Pena family, any night was a perfectly good night to flaunt success, or rather, to flaunt my sister's success. My name is Amaya Pena. I was 28 years old, a plant conservationist whose daily uniform usually consisted of soil-stained boots and durable canvas work jackets. Sitting at that massive mahogany table, surrounded by plush velvet upholstery and waiters who moved silently like ghosts, I felt like a stubborn weed that had somehow sprouted in the middle of a perfectly manicured botanical garden. I wore a simple black dress I had bought years ago, feeling the fabric pull slightly against my shoulders, acutely aware of how vastly I differed from the people sharing my blood. We were there to celebrate Chloe, my younger sister, just 24 years old, was officially launching her new social media lifestyle brand. She called it a holistic wellness empire, but from what I gathered over the imported caviar appetizers, it was mostly about selling overpriced silk robes and promoting an aesthetic of effortless, unattainable wealth. The conversation around the table bounced endlessly between engagement rates, blue-chip stock portfolios, and upcoming luxury retreats in the Maldives. I focused entirely on my plate, cutting my medium-rare steak into unnecessarily small pieces just to have a valid excuse to keep my head down and my mouth shut. The engagement on your latest promotional post was absolutely phenomenal, sweetheart. My mother, Elena, cooed. She lifted her glass of vintage champagne, the heavy diamond bracelet on her wrist catching the ambient light and throwing sparks across the table. I was just telling my friends at the country club this morning that you reached 500,000 followers in under 3 months. It is unprecedented. To Chloe, the brilliant future of the family. Crystal glasses clinked together in a harmonious chime. I raised my sparkling water silently, taking a very small sip. The cold liquid felt exactly like ash sliding down my throat. My father, Marcus, leaned back heavily in his custom leather chair. He possessed the kind of polished, aggressive aura that came from orchestrating decades of ruthless corporate buyouts. He reached inside the breast pocket of his impeccably tailored Italian suit and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He placed his large hand over it, building the anticipation, before sliding it slowly across the polished wood table toward Chloe. "A visionary mind like yours needs proper backing," my father said, his voice carrying the booming, confident resonance of a man completely used to being obeyed without question. "Inside this envelope is a cashier's check for $150,000. Consider it seed money for a winner. We only invest in the absolute best, and you, Chloe, are without a doubt the best." Chloe gasped loudly, pressing both of her perfectly manicured hands to her cheeks in a practiced, theatrical display of shock. "Oh my God, Dad, Mom, this is amazing. I promise I'm going to double this amount in exactly 6 months. You will not regret this investment." The private room erupted in another round of self-congratulatory applause. I continued to meticulously cut my steak. I did not speak a word. I did not offer a glaring look of jealousy. I simply existed in my isolated corner of the table, quietly breathing in the suffocating, toxic air of their mutual adoration. My silence, however, was always perceived as a direct provocation by my father. He could never stand it when I refused to participate in the grand family theater. Marcus slowly turned his intense gaze toward me. The warm, proud light in his eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. It was the exact same look he gave a plunging, worthless stock graph on his monitor. "Nothing at all to say, Amaya?" he asked, his tone dripping with heavy condescension. "Congratulations, Chloe," I said quietly, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of emotion. "It is a very generous gift." My father scoffed loudly, dramatically throwing his crisp linen napkin onto the table. "Gift, it is a strategic investment, something someone like you would not possibly understand. Look at yourself. 28 years old, face buried in the mud at some pathetic no-name conservation company, making absolute pennies. You come to a celebratory dinner like this looking like you just crawled out of a roadside ditch." The entire table went completely still. Even the sommelier refilling wine glasses 2 tables away in the main dining area seemed to freeze in place. "Marcus," my mother whispered, though there was absolutely no real reprimand or defense in her tone. She was merely playing her part as the peacemaker for the sake of appearances. He ignored her completely, leaning forward over the table to deliver the final, crushing blow. "We spent an absolute fortune raising you, sending you to elite private schools, giving you every conceivable advantage in life, and for what return? So you can play in the dirt with weeds. You are an expensive failure to this family. Amaya, a complete and utter disappointment." He paused, waiting for the inevitable tears. He waited for the defensive stuttering, the pathetic apologies, the desperate attempts to justify my existence that had tragically defined my early 20s. He wanted me to break down in front of them so he could feel entirely justified in his cruelty. But the tears never came. The frantic, pathetic need for his approval had quietly died inside me months ago, replaced by a profound, hollow clarity. I looked directly at my father. Then I shifted my gaze to my mother, who was purposefully avoiding my eyes by staring at her champagne, and finally at Chloe, who was already eagerly tracing the edge of the thick envelope with a greedy, triumphant smile. They were strangers to me. They had always been strangers. I smiled. It was not a bitter, twisted smile, but a soft, almost relieved expression. I placed my silver fork neatly on the edge of the porcelain plate. I reached into my leather bag, pulled out 3 crisp $100 bills, and laid them gently on the pristine white tablecloth, to more than cover my portion of the extravagant meal and the gratuity. "Enjoy the investment," I said. I stood up smoothly, pushed my heavy chair in, and walked away. I did not look back even once as I navigated through the labyrinth of elegant tables, out the heavy brass-handled glass doors, and into the warm, humid Texas night. The deafening silence I left behind in that restaurant was the most powerful thing I had ever created, and it definitively marked the permanent severing of the only chains that had ever held me down. Walking away into the humid evening air did not trigger any profound sorrow, because the emotional detachment had firmly established its roots a very long time ago. I grew up as a living ghost haunting the perfectly curated, marble-floored halls of our own sprawling estate. The contrast between my sister and me was not just noticeable, it was an aggressively enforced family policy. Chloe was the magnificent showpiece, the undeniable focal point of their existence. My parents eagerly poured tens of thousands of dollars into her aesthetic development without batting an eye. She was provided with elite pageant coaches, private theatrical acting tutors, and custom-made silk gowns before she had even reached the 7th grade. Her childhood was treated as a carefully managed, high-stakes portfolio. Mine, on the other hand, was an uncomfortable afterthought. While she practiced artificial smiles in front of an expensive ring light, I spent my weekends wandering the quiet aisles of the city library. I dug through dusty discount bins at local estate sales, just to find discarded botany textbooks and out-of-print biology manuals. I taught myself the complex Latin names of indigenous flora, and the subtle chemistry of soil pH levels while they loudly debated whether Chloe's professional headshots should have a matte or a glossy finish. I was completely invisible, existing entirely in the peripheral vision of their glamorous lives. The defining moment of my youth, the exact second the fragile illusion of family love completely shattered, happened when I was exactly 14 years old. I had spent 8 painstaking, laborious months cultivating a hybrid climbing rose in a neglected, deeply shaded corner of our massive backyard. It was a meticulous process of cross-pollination and careful pruning. The result was a delicate, pale lavender bloom possessing a unique scent that smelled exactly like fresh rain hitting dry earth. It was my absolute proudest achievement. I wanted to show them my success. I truly, desperately believed that if I created something undeniably beautiful, they would finally look at me the way they constantly looked at her. The day my beautiful hybrid finally bloomed happened to coincide perfectly with Chloe's 10th birthday extravaganza. My parents had rented massive carnival tents, hired professional acrobats, and invited half the prominent, wealthy socialites residing in our county. As the deafening party reached its peak, I ran inside the house to pull my mother toward the garden. I begged her to come outside and see my botanical creation. "Not right now, Amaya," she had snapped sharply, her anxious eyes tracking the movements of the hired caterers. "Can you not see we are currently hosting the mayor?" Later that evening, seeking a quiet refuge from the overwhelming noise and the blinding lights, I walked out to my hidden corner. The lavender rose was completely gone. In its place was a crushed, muddy stem, violently trampled and snapped under the heavy heel of someone's expensive dress shoe. My father had dragged a massive, heavy sound system right over my delicate garden bed just to set up an outdoor karaoke machine for the guests. He had not even noticed the destruction he caused. When I brought the mangled, ruined stem into the bright kitchen, tears silently streaming down my face, he barely even glanced up from his expensive glass of scotch. "It is just a weed, Amaya," he sighed with deep impatience. "Tell the landscaping crew to clear out that entire patch tomorrow morning. It looks terribly messy and ruins the aesthetic of the yard." That crushed, lifeless flower taught me everything I ever needed to know about the cold economics of my family. I realized then that for them, parental love was never a biological imperative or a nurturing, unconditional bond. Their love was high-risk venture capitalism. They only injected their emotional and financial capital into living assets that guaranteed a massive social return on investment. Chloe generated intense envy from the bored country club wives and profound admiration from the corporate board members. She was a highly performing asset. I was an absolute dead zone. My deep fascination with the earth, with the quiet, intricate miracles of soil and cellular growth, yielded zero social currency in their elite circles. It could not be photographed for a glossy magazine spread or bragged about over an expensive 18-hole game of golf. When I finally chose to pursue a university degree in agriculture and plant conservation, they viewed my academic decision as a deliberate, dirty rebellion. To them, I was actively and maliciously choosing to drag their pristine, upper-class image straight through the mud. My career path was a dark stain on their perfect canvas. Every single family gathering during my early 20s became a grueling exercise in mental endurance. I tried, repeatedly and foolishly, to bridge the massive gap between us. I would carefully bring rare, hand-propagated orchids as thoughtful peace offerings for holidays and birthdays. They would politely accept them with tight, forced smiles, and I would inevitably find those same beautiful plants dying of severe neglect in a guest bathroom exactly 3 weeks later. If I ever tried to speak passionately about my professional research concerning drought-resistant crops or vital ecosystem restoration, their eyes would instantly glaze over with profound boredom. "That all sounds very exhausting and terribly unhygienic," my mother would interrupt, waving her manicured hand dismissively to cut me off. "Chloe, please tell Aunt Sylvia about your upcoming audition in Los Angeles. That is much more exciting." I spent my entire youth and the majority of my 20s desperately trying to bloom in soil that was fundamentally toxic to my very existence. The truly tragic part of my childhood was not that they actively hated me. Hate actually requires a certain level of passion and focus. The tragic part was their absolute, unwavering, and chilling indifference. I was simply a bad investment they had long since written off, a frustrating rounding error in the grand, glamorous ledger of their lives. Exactly 3 months after I left those three crisp $100 bills on the pristine restaurant tablecloth, the fragile foundation of my independent life completely collapsed. The small conservation firm I worked for suffered a catastrophic blow. Our primary state grant was abruptly pulled, leading to an immediate, company-wide downsizing protocol. I remember sitting in the sterile human resources office, clutching a cheap plastic pen as the manager mechanically explained the severance package, which was basically non-existent. The company offered a payout equivalent to exactly 2 weeks of my meager salary. I packed my botanical reference books, my worn gardening gloves, and a few framed photographs of the wetlands into a flimsy cardboard box. The walk back to my apartment felt like moving through thick mud. The harsh roar of the city subway sounded like a continuous alarm warning me of impending doom. The urban landscape felt like a giant concrete trap closing in on me. Financial ruin in the city does not arrive slowly. It hits you like a speeding freight train. My salary had barely covered my basic living expenses, and my savings account held exactly $42.16. My cramped apartment, which always smelled faintly of old water pipes and cheap bleach, suddenly transformed into a ticking time bomb. The landlord taped a brightly colored eviction notice to my peeling wooden door, giving me exactly 14 days to produce the overdue rent or face immediate removal by the authorities. I spent exactly 9 days pacing the tiny living room, calculating impossible budgets, applying for dozens of jobs that never responded, and rationing a single 10-pound bag of rice. The panic was a physical weight, pressing heavily against my ribcage. I sold my winter coat and my bicycle, but the cash I received did not cover 1/4 of the debt I owed. It is terrifying how extreme desperation can overwrite years of hard-learned lessons. On the 9th night of my eviction countdown, sitting on a bare mattress in the dark, because the electric company had already cut the power, I broke. The crushing weight of absolute isolation stripped away my pride. I convinced myself that perhaps, just this once, facing the stark reality of their flesh and blood sleeping on the freezing concrete streets, my parents might show a single ounce of basic human decency. With trembling fingers, I pulled up my mother's contact on my cracked phone screen. I pressed the green call button, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. The line rang exactly 1 time, followed immediately by the automated voicemail recording. She had actively declined the call. The sharp beep of the machine echoing in the silent, dark apartment was a physical slap to the face. Numb, I let the phone drop into my lap. The screen lit up with a bright notification from a social media application. I opened it blindly, and the glowing screen illuminated my dark room with the ultimate display of cruel irony. It was a brand new post from Chloe. The photograph featured my parents and my sister standing on the sun-drenched deck of a massive private yacht docked somewhere along the sparkling Mediterranean coast. My mother was holding a crystal glass of vintage wine, and my father was wrapping a protective arm around Chloe's shoulders. They all wore pristine white linen, their smiles bright and perfectly curated for the digital audience. They were celebrating the grand global expansion of her wellness brand. Below the picture, Chloe had written a highly emotional caption praising their unwavering support. The final sentence read, "Family is the absolute only launchpad you will ever need to touch the stars." I stared at the word launchpad until the letters blurred together. Then, a peculiar detail caught my eye. Below the thousands of glowing comments, there was a single comment thread that had been actively flagged and hidden by the account owner. My curiosity got the better of me. I clicked the small text to reveal the hidden replies. A user without a profile picture had written a frantic warning. The user explicitly accused Chloe's company of operating as a sophisticated financial scam. The detailed paragraph explained how hundreds of thousands of dollars in investor funds were being illegally diverted to fund these lavish European vacations, while the actual product suppliers and entry-level employees remained entirely unpaid for over 3 months. My family was completely aware of the rotting foundation beneath their golden child. They were actively deleting the warnings and desperately keeping the glittering illusion alive at all costs. They were perfectly willing to commit massive financial fraud to maintain their elite social standing, while ignoring a desperate phone call from their other daughter who was hours away from homelessness. In that precise moment, the final shred of familial obligation inside my chest withered and died completely. The terrified girl vanished, leaving behind a profound, freezing clarity. I opened my phone settings and systematically blocked my mother, my father, and my sister across every single platform. I permanently deleted my primary email account and formatted the device. I packed exactly 2 heavy canvas duffel bags with practical clothing, my essential documents, and my botanical tools. I placed the apartment keys on the kitchen counter, locked the door, and walked out into the freezing midnight air. I removed my presence from their radar, vanishing without leaving a single trace behind. The bus ride took exactly 22 hours, carrying me far away from the polished glass buildings and the choking exhaust of the city. I ended up in a forgotten, mist-shrouded valley nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. I had exactly $12.50 left in my pocket when I stepped off the heavily rusted Greyhound bus onto the cracked asphalt of a small town that did not even possess a single traffic light. I walked 3 miles up a winding, steep dirt road until I found a weathered wooden sign hanging by a single rusted hinge. It advertised a failing, dilapidated plant nursery. The owner was an elderly man whose back was permanently bowed from a lifetime of relentless hard labor. I did not ask for a salary or a formal contract. I offered him 14 hours of grueling manual labor every single day in exchange for a dry place to sleep in the drafty, uninsulated tool shed and whatever bruised vegetables I could pull from the ground. He looked at my soft, uncalloused city hands, scoffed quietly to himself, but pointed silently toward a rusty metal wheelbarrow. The first few weeks were a physical agony I had never experienced. The Appalachian soil was completely unforgiving, packed thick with dense red clay and sharp shale rock that tore right through my cheap canvas work gloves. My palms broke out in heavy, weeping blisters that eventually hardened into thick, yellow calluses. My lower back ached so deeply I could barely stand up straight when the sun finally dipped below the tree line. But for the very first time in my entire 28 years of life, my mind was absolutely quiet. The crippling anxiety of trying to please parents who actively despised me was entirely gone, replaced by the simple, honest rhythm of basic survival. Every drop of sweat that soaked my shirt felt like a holy baptism, washing away the toxic, artificial residue of my former life. I did not just haul heavy bags of dirt. I began to quietly apply the intense biological and conservation expertise that my family had deemed entirely worthless. The nursery was failing largely because the elderly owner was stubbornly trying to grow fragile, water-heavy ornamental flowers in a mountainous region, experiencing increasingly harsh seasonal droughts. I systematically convinced him to let me clear out 2 full acres of completely dead, withered land in the far back of the property. Once I had the empty space, I went to work. I meticulously cross-pollinated native wildings with commercial strains to engineer incredibly resilient, drought-resistant rootstocks. I hiked several miles into the dense, untamed forest long before dawn to responsibly harvest native medicinal seeds. I began cultivating rare Appalachian herbs, like wild ginseng and specialized mints, that were highly sought after by holistic markets, but nearly impossible to grow in commercial captivity. The soil was rocky and stubborn, but I was exactly the same. We understood each other perfectly. It was during my 3rd month at the nursery, while I was carefully grafting a rare strain of mountain flora, that I formally met Julian. He had been coming around the property for a few weeks, purchasing scrap lumber and buying whatever leftover crops the old man had on discount. Julian was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a quiet, observant intensity that perfectly matched the surrounding mountains. I learned later that he was a highly sought-after landscape architect from Chicago who had suffered severe corporate burnout, permanently dropped his lucrative career, and retreated to the woods to work purely with his hands as a custom carpenter. There were no fake, polite introductions between us. Our entire relationship began with a shared silence and a deep, mutual respect for the raw integrity of physical labor. He would often park his battered truck near my plot, quietly watching me splice microscopic plant fibers with the intense precision of a surgeon. One afternoon, a violent, unexpected summer storm ripped through the valley. The heavy winds completely tore the flimsy plastic roof off my makeshift propagation tent, threatening to drown a batch of extremely rare heirloom seeds I had spent 4 months painstakingly germinating. Before I could even scream for help, Julian was there. We worked shoulder to shoulder in the freezing, driving rain for 3 straight hours, dragging heavy canvas tarps and hammering wooden support beams deep into the muddy earth to save the fragile crop. When the storm finally broke, we sat heavily on the lowered tailgate of his truck, entirely covered in mud and gasping for air. "You have an absolute genius for genetic botany, Amaya," Julian said, his voice low and incredibly steady. "What you are doing in this miserable little patch of dirt is nothing short of a biological miracle, but you are completely bottlenecked by a severe lack of proper infrastructure." I looked down at my ruined, mud-stained boots. "Infrastructure requires massive capital. I have exactly $17 to my name right now." "I do not want your money," Julian replied, looking out over the misty, rain-soaked valley. "I want to build something that actually matters. I have the architectural knowledge and the advanced carpentry skills. I know exactly how to source salvaged materials, industrial glass, and recycled steel from abandoned factory sites in the next county. If I design and construct a fully automated, climate-controlled smart greenhouse system, can you scale up this rare genetic propagation?" I looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. There was no hidden agenda in his dark eyes, no disgusting demand for a social return on investment. It was a pure, honest partnership forged in dirt and rain. "Yes, I can scale it massively," I answered without hesitation. That single conversation was the quiet spark that ignited an unstoppable empire. We started entirely from scratch. Julian spent the next 6 months dragging discarded heavy materials out of regional scrapyards. He brilliantly engineered a closed-loop geothermal heating system utilizing the natural ambient temperature of the mountain earth, combined with a highly advanced rainwater catchment network. He built 3 massive, stunning glass and steel structures tucked invisibly into the dense forest canopy. Inside those secure walls, I unleashed the full, unbridled capacity of my scientific knowledge. I cultivated highly exclusive, flavor-dense microgreens, rare truffles, and incredibly potent medicinal botanicals. We did not waste our valuable time trying to sell at local town markets for pennies. Julian used his old high society city contacts, and I leveraged my deep understanding of agricultural scarcity. We packed our premium, exclusive harvests in secure, temperature-controlled transport cases, and shipped them directly to executive chefs running 3-star Michelin restaurants in New York and Chicago. We offered them unique flavor profiles and delicate textures they could not legally source anywhere else on the North American continent. The culinary response was absolutely explosive. Those elite restaurants happily paid hundreds of dollars for a single ounce of our specialized herbs. Simultaneously, I started bidding heavily on state-funded ecological restoration contracts. Because my custom-engineered, drought-resistant saplings had a proven survival rate of 98% compared to the pathetic industry standard of 60%. We began easily winning government grants worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. We were actively repairing fire-damaged forests and deeply eroded wetlands across the entire eastern seaboard. The wealth did not arrive with loud, obnoxious parties or flashy social media announcements. It flowed in silently, steadily, like a deep underground river. We aggressively reinvested every single dollar, silently buying up hundreds of acres of surrounding mountain land to fiercely protect our privacy and expand our operations. Our business bank accounts quickly grew from a few $100s into the multi-million-dollar range. I was generating more liquid capital in a single month than my father had ever made in a full year at his prestigious corporate firm. But unlike my toxic family, Julian and I had zero desire to flaunt our success. We still wore our worn-out leather boots. We still drank our black coffee on the wooden porch at dawn. And we still buried our calloused hands deep in the soil every single day. From absolutely nothing, we had built a fortress of absolute financial invincibility, completely hidden away in the quiet, healing shadows of the Appalachian wilderness. 2 full years vanished into the steady, demanding rhythm of the mountain seasons. In that time, the small patch of cleared earth Julian and I started with expanded into an impenetrable, high-tech agricultural fortress spanning over 300 acres of prime Appalachian forest. We operated an entirely self-sustaining ecosystem. Our power was generated by a sprawling grid of hidden solar arrays and deep geothermal wells. We lived a life of absolute autonomy, generating multi-million-dollar revenues annually while remaining entirely invisible to the outside world. The frantic, ego-driven noise of the city felt like a fever dream belonging to a completely different lifetime. I was no longer the anxious, timid girl who used to shrink into the heavy velvet upholstery of an Austin steakhouse. The brutal, unforgiving labor and the undeniable, concrete results of my botanical engineering had forged an unbreakable core of confidence inside me. I became a highly respected, almost mythical figure within the elite, upper echelon circles of advanced agriculture and sustainable technology. Major global financial publications and environmental journals constantly flooded our encrypted corporate email with desperate requests for exclusive interviews and cover stories. They wanted the secrets behind our unprecedented crop yields and our revolutionary drought-resistant genetics. I routinely denied every single request for a face-to-face interview. I categorically refused to allow any cameras onto the property. My work was meant to heal the earth, not feed the insatiable machinery of public relations. However, total anonymity is nearly impossible to maintain when you are silently disrupting a billion-dollar global industry. On a brisk Tuesday morning in late October, a highly prestigious international economic magazine published a massive feature article titled, "The Reclusive Green Billionaires." I was sitting on the wooden porch, drinking my dark coffee, when Julian handed me the glossy print copy. "You made the front page," he said quietly, tapping the heavy paper. One of their aggressive investigative journalists had hiked up a neighboring ridge and used a high-powered telephoto lens to snap a panoramic photograph of our main valley. The massive, gleaming glass and steel greenhouses looked like a futuristic colony dropped right into the middle of the untamed wilderness. And there, standing directly in front of the central climate control hub, was my distinct silhouette. You could not see my facial features, but my posture, the way I stood firmly rooted to the earth with my hands resting on my hips, was unmistakable to anyone who actually knew me. The universe possesses an incredibly dark, symmetrical sense of humor. On the exact same day, my shadowy figure was being analyzed by Wall Street investors as the future of sustainable agriculture. Another set of photographs was utterly dominating the chaotic 24-hour news cycle. My sister was officially trending globally, but it was a catastrophic nightmare. Every major news network and internet tabloid was simultaneously broadcasting the absolute annihilation of Chloe's so-called wellness brand. The federal trade authorities had violently kicked in the glass doors of her Los Angeles headquarters at dawn. The entire company was exposed as a massive, predatory multi-level marketing scam, functioning basically as an illegal pyramid scheme. There were 0 holistic products being manufactured. The massive influx of cash was solely generated by aggressively scamming thousands of desperate, lower-income women into paying exorbitant franchise fees. I sat perfectly still on the porch, watching the chaotic news footage on Julian's tablet. I watched a shaky cell phone video of federal agents shoving my screaming, hysterical 26-year-old sister into the back of an unmarked government vehicle. Her expensive silk clothes were wrinkled, and her meticulously crafted public image was instantly reduced to ash. But the absolute destruction did not stop with Chloe. The financial contagion rapidly spread to the very root of the rot: my parents. The ruthless venture capitalists, who proudly declared they only backed undeniable winners, had tethered their entire legacy to her sinking ship. In their blind, arrogant desperation to fuel Chloe's rapid expansion and secure their own social dominance, Marcus and Elena had legally signed on as the primary corporate guarantors for all her massive commercial loans. They had blindly leveraged every single asset they owned against her fraudulent projections. The legal fallout was immediate and absolutely merciless. A federal judge instantly ordered a total freeze on all their financial assets to begin compensating the thousands of defrauded victims. The news anchors gleefully detailed how the authorities had officially seized their sprawling Austin estate, locked down their offshore bank accounts, and impounded their fleet of luxury vehicles. The untouchable, glittering Pina family was unceremoniously thrown out onto the literal street with nothing but the expensive clothes on their backs. They had spent their entire lives treating human relationships like cold, calculating financial transactions. They had callously discarded me because I did not offer a fast enough return on their emotional investment. Now, their chosen golden asset had completely crashed, bankrupting them not just morally, but in every conceivable, literal sense of the word. I turned off the tablet, handed it back to Julian, and calmly walked back down to my greenhouses. The mountain air was crisp and clean, and I had a fragile new strain of winter wheat that desperately needed my attention. Their chaotic, burning world was millions of miles away from my quiet, thriving empire. Exactly 14 days after the magazine article hit the newsstands, the perimeter security alarms of the farm chimed softly in the main office. I was reviewing the quarterly agricultural yield reports with Julian when I glanced up at the high-definition security monitors. A battered, heavily rusted, light blue rental car was idling roughly at the base of our primary security gate. The engine was coughing thick black smoke into the pristine mountain air. The doors creaked open, and 3 figures stepped out onto the dusty gravel road. It took me several long seconds to fully recognize them. The glittering, untouchable Pena family had been completely erased, replaced by hollow, terrified shells. Marcus wore a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit that hung loosely off his suddenly gaunt, exhausted frame. Elena had absolutely no makeup on, her hair unkempt and blowing wildly in the wind, completely devoid of the heavy diamond jewelry that used to define her entire existence. Chloe, the former golden child and fake wellness guru, looked entirely destroyed. She was wearing oversized, stained gray sweatpants, her face pale, frantically biting her fingernails as she stared up at the massive steel gates protecting my property. I did not feel a sudden dramatic rush of adrenaline. I did not feel any burning anger. I simply felt the exact same cold, clinical detachment I experienced when finding a blighted, dead weed creeping toward a healthy crop. I put down my tablet. Julian wordlessly picked up a thick, leather-bound document folder from the desk and followed me out the door. We walked slowly down the long, winding gravel driveway. The heavy iron gates remained firmly locked, providing a solid, undeniable barrier between my peaceful sanctuary and their chaotic ruin. As I approached, Marcus immediately stepped forward and grabbed the cold iron bars with both hands. He tried to stand tall, desperately attempting to project his old, terrifying corporate authority, but his voice cracked with pathetic, undeniable desperation. "Open the gate, Amaya," my father commanded, though it sounded more like a dry, painful wheeze. "We have been driving for 36 hours straight just to find this place. Do you have any idea what we have been through over the past 3 weeks?" I stopped exactly 3 feet from the gate, clasping my hands comfortably in front of me. I am perfectly aware of what happened. It has been broadcast on every single major news network 24 hours a day. Elena pushed forward, pressing her face near the bars, her hands trembling violently. Amaya, please. The federal government seized absolutely everything we own. Our bank accounts are completely frozen. The house is gone. The country club revoked our memberships. We had to borrow cash from a former housekeeper just to rent this disgusting vehicle. You have to help us. There was no apology in her voice. There was not a single word of regret for the decades of emotional abuse, for treating me like absolute garbage, or for aggressively abandoning me when I was literally facing homelessness. Their immense arrogance had simply mutated into a toxic, desperate form of entitlement. Marcus slammed his open hand against the iron bar, trying to force intimidation. We saw the financial magazine. We know exactly what you are hiding back there. You own hundreds of acres of prime, highly developed agricultural land. You are sitting on a massive, hidden fortune. You need to immediately liquidate a portion of this farm and transfer the capital directly to my legal team. We need millions of dollars to fight these federal fraud charges and keep your sister out of a federal prison. It is your fundamental responsibility as a child of this family to step up when we are in a crisis. I looked quietly at Chloe, who was hiding behind my mother's shoulder, refusing to even make eye contact with me. Then I looked back at my father. He truly believed I was still that desperate, anxious girl waiting around for a tiny scrap of his validation. Julian silently stepped forward and handed me the heavy leather document folder. I opened it slowly, pulling out a thick stack of crisp, notarized legal contracts bearing the gold seal of the largest commercial bank in Texas. You have fundamentally misunderstood the situation, I said, my voice perfectly calm and entirely devoid of any emotional fluctuation. You see, when the federal courts ordered the immediate liquidation of your massive estate to pay off the defrauded investors, your primary bank put all your commercial and private assets up for an emergency blind auction. They needed to recover cash immediately. I held up the first document, pressing it flat against the iron bars so Marcus could read the bold black print. I did not just build this mountain farm from scratch, I continued smoothly. I structured an anonymous corporate holding company 2 years ago to carefully manage my massive excess capital, the very land you are standing on right now. The road leading up to this gate, and the 300 acres surrounding us, were originally purchased directly through that exact same bank, because my business accounts hold significantly more liquid capital than your entire family ever possessed. They offer me absolute priority on their distressed assets. Marcus squinted at the paper, his sunken eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror as he recognized the official state seal and the legal property description of his beloved Austin properties. I bought your house, Marcus, I stated plainly, watching the reality crush him. I bought your massive corporate office building in downtown Austin. I purchased every single piece of foreclosed debt your family generated through my anonymous company for absolute pennies on the dollar. I literally own the very ground you used to walk on, and I plan to bulldoze your pristine country estate next month to build a commercial soil composting facility. Elena let out a piercing, hysterical sob, collapsing entirely onto her knees in the dirt. Chloe finally looked up, her eyes wide with total disbelief and suffocating terror. You cannot do this, Marcus gasped, his face turning a sickening shade of pale gray. He was shaking uncontrollably, his fingers slipping off the iron bars as his legs weakened. We are your family. We gave you your life. I looked at him with profound emptiness. I vividly remembered the delicate lavender rose crushed violently under his heavy shoe. I remembered the $150,000 check handed to a smiling fraud. I remembered the freezing, dark city apartment where I almost starved to death while they drank champagne on a yacht. You told me once, at a very expensive dinner, that you only invest in winners, I said quietly, letting the heavy words hang in the crisp mountain air. Coincidentally, so do I. And looking at the three of you right now, I do not see anyone here capable of turning a profit. I did not wait for his desperate response. I reached into my canvas jacket pocket and pressed the heavy remote control button. The massive security system engaged with a loud, mechanical hum. The secondary solid steel blast doors began to slide shut directly behind the iron gates. permanently sealing the entrance to my world. Marcus began to scream, a guttural, pathetic sound of absolute defeat, weakly pounding his fists against the shifting metal. Elena was wailing loudly in the dirt, and Chloe was completely paralyzed by the shock of her ruined reality. I turned my back on them and began walking up the gravel path, alongside Julian. The bright afternoon sunlight filtered beautifully through the tall pine trees, illuminating the massive, gleaming glass roofs of my greenhouses in the distance. The frantic, desperate screaming behind me grew fainter and fainter with every step I took, until the heavy steel doors finally locked shut with a deafening thud. Silence returned to the beautiful valley. The absolute perfect revenge was never about shouting or seeking violent retribution. It was the simple, beautiful act of proving their total irrelevance in the magnificent, thriving world I had planted, watered, and grown entirely with my own two hands. Thank you so much, wonderful listeners, for tuning into this story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are listening from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping us out with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the PayPal link provided in the description or the pinned comment below. Your generous support allows us to pay our dedicated staff, helping them feed their families, and ensures we can continue creating more amazing stories for you to enjoy. Have a beautiful day, and stay strong.